It is with great pleasure that I welcome you, as the Acting Director of the Institute of Historical Research, to another talk in the series of Autumn Lectures in Classics. This series began in 2015 with the initiative of our colleagues Sofia Kremidi and Mirina Kalaidzi in collaboration with the British School at Athens. And my colleague Sofia Kremidi θα σας πει περισσότερα για αυτή τη σειρά των διαλέξεων σε λίγο. As with previous lectures, I'm certain that today's insight into the relationship between prose and verse, as well as between antiquity and 19th century philosophical thought, as presented by our guest Professor Vasunia, will give us plenty of food for thought. So thank you for coming once again. Sophia.
Να σας ευχαριστήσω και εγώ πολύ σύντομα για την παρουσία σας εδώ και τον ομιλητή μας φυσικά που έχει έρθει από το Λονδίνο. Και εγώ θέλω απλώς να σας πω δύο λόγια για το λόγο και για την ιδέα που έχουμε πίσω από αυτή τη συνεργασία που έχουμε την ελληνοβρετανική και για τους στόχους αυτής της συνεργασίας μας. Λοιπόν, είναι πολλαπλός ο στόχος αυτής της συνεργασίας. Καταρχήν, θέλουμε να δημιουργήσουμε ένα διάλογο ανάμεσα στους εκπροσώπους των σύγχρονων ρευμάτων στη μελέτη της αρχαιογνωσίας και να προσφέρουμε στην ακαδημαϊκή κοινότητα της Αθήνας την ευκαιρία να παρακολουθήσει και να συνομιλήσει με μερικούς από τους πιο αξιόλογους ακαδημαϊκούς δασκάλους και στοχαστές που προέρχονται από πανεπιστήμια του Ηνωμένου Βασιλείου. Ο δεύτερος στόχος μας είναι να αναδείξουμε τη σημασία της μελέτης της αρχαιότητας, των διαφόρων εκφάνσεων του ελληνικού πολιτισμού που ενέπνευσε από την εποχή της αναγέννησης και πνέει ακόμα με εντελώς διαφορετικό τρόπο σήμερα το σύγχρονο ευρωπαϊκό πολιτισμό. Η φιλοσοφία, η λογοτεχνία, η ιστοριογραφία, η τέχνη, αλλά και η αρχιτεκτονική της ελληνικής αρχαιότητας, άλλοτε απευθείας, άλλοτε με ενδιάμεσους τους Ρωμαίους, αποτέλεσαν μια πολύτιμη πρώτη ύλη πάνω στην οποία χτίστηκε το οικοδόμημα του ευρωπαϊκού πολιτισμού. Με τις ομιλίες αυτές θέλουμε να παρουσιάσουμε μια σύγχρονη μορφή της αρχαιογνωσίας που εξελίσσει τις αρχές του κλασικισμού και δεν μένει καθυλωμένη στη σχολιστική προσέγγιση των καταλήπων της αρχαιότητας. Επιδιώκουμε να αναδείξουμε τα λογοτεχνικά, ιστορικά ή φιλοσοφικά κείμενα, αλλά και τα μνημεία του ελληνικού πολιτισμού ως ζωντανά τμήματα ενός ενιαίου κόσμου, ο οποίος μας αφορά στην ολότητά του. Το να ξανακοιτάξουμε σήμερα, όπως κάνει ο σημερινός μας ομιλητής, με φρέσκο μάτι την αρχαία γραμματεία, έχει πολλαπλά ωφέλη. Γιατί αν αρνηθούμε να καταβάλουμε τον κόπο που απαιτείται για να προσεγγίσουμε τα αρχαία κείμενα, θα αποκοπούμε από το παρελθόν μας και θα περάσουμε στη λύθη. Και τότε θα έχουμε χάσει το νήμα που μας έφερε ως εδώ και θα έχουμε γίνει πολύ απλά πολύ φτωχότεροι. Με αυτά τα δύο λόγια κλείνω. And I now invite John Bennett, Director of the British School, to please introduce today's speaker. Welcome.
Κυρίες συνάδελφοι, κυρίες και κύριοι, θα ήθελα και εγώ ως Διευθυντής της Βρετανικής Σχολής Αθηνών να σας καλωσορίσω εδώ στο Εθνικό Ίδρυμα Ερευνών. Επίσης, σας μεταβιβάζω τους χαιρετισμούς του καθηγητή Greg Wolfe, Διευθυντή του Ινστιτούτου Κλασικών Σπουδών στο Λονδίνο, του τρίτου χορηγού της σημερινής φθινοπορεινής διάλεξης, ο οποίος λυπάται που δεν μπορεί να παρευρεθεί στην σημερινή διάλεξη. Μου δίνει ιδιαίτερη χαρά να παρουσιάσω απόψε τον ομιλητή εκ μέρους όλων των διοργανωτών. Ο Phiroze Vasunia είναι από το 2014 καθηγητής ελληνικών σπουδών στο University College του Πανεπιστημίου του Λονδίνου, όπου διδάσκει επίσης στο τμήμα ελληνικών και λατινικών σπουδών και στο πρόγραμμα συγκριτικής φιλολογίας. Γεννήθηκε και μορφώθηκε στην Ινδία και είναι πτυχιούχος του Pomona College της Καλιφόρνιας στην Αμερική. Εκπώνησε την διδακτορική του διατριβή στο Πανεπιστήμιο του Στάνφορντ υπό την επίβλεψη της καθηγήτριας Susan Stevens με θέμα Hellenizing Egypt. Πριν από την τωρινή του έδρα στο Λονδίνο, είχε αναλάβει θέσεις στα πανεπιστήμια του North Carolina, στο Chapel Hill, στην Αμερική, και του Reading στην Αγγλία, όπου το 2012 ανήλθε στην βαθμίδα του καθηγητή. Τα ερευνητικά του έργα, τα οποία είναι εξαιρετικά και σε ποιότητα αλλά και σε ποσότητα, συμπεριλαμβάνουν δύο νήματα. Το πρώτο είναι η πολιτισμική διάδραση και το πολιτικό της πλαίσιο. Εκπροσωπείται αφενός από την πρώτη του μονογραφία, The Gift of the Nile, Hellenizing Egypt from Aeschylus to Alexander, Berkeley 2001, με έμφαση στον αρχαίο ελληνικό κόσμο, και αφετέρου από την δεύτερη του μονογραφία, The Classics and Colonial India, Oxford 2013, η οποία επικεντρώνεται στην περίοδο 1750 ως 1947, στο πλαίσιο δηλαδή της Βρετανικής Αυτοκρατορίας. Αυτό το βιβλίο εκδηλώνει επιστημονικό ενδιαφέρον και στην υποδοχή, reception στα αγγλικά, του πολιτισμού της αρχαίας Ελλάδας και στα θέματα της μεταπικιοκρατίας και της αυτοκρατορίας. Τα ίδια θέματα φαίνονται και σε δύο ακόμη εκδοτικά έργα, Classics and National Cultures, 2010, σε συνεργασία με την Susan Stevens, και India, Greece and Rome, σε συνεργασία με την Edith Hall, η οποία πριν από 2 χρόνια έδωσε διάλεξη εδώ, στο ίδιο πλαίσιο των φθινοπορεινών διαλέξεων. Αυτό το νήμα αντακλάται στο ρόλο του Phiroze ως συντονιστή του δικτύου για τους αρχαίους και σύγχρονους αυτοκρατορισμούς, Network for Ancient and Modern Imperialisms, και ως μέλος της ομάδας μετακλασικισμών, Post-Classicisms. Αυτή τη στιγμή ασχολείται με ακόμα ένα τόμος με θέμα την μεταπικιοκρατία, Empire Without End, Post-Colonial Theory and the Ancient World. Το δεύτερο νήμα του επιστημονικού του έργου επικεντρώνεται στην έννοια του είδους, genre, στις αρχαίες λογοτεχνίες και στην πολιτική του σημασία. Με αυτό το θέμα ετοιμάζει σε συνεργασία 2 τόμους, The Politics of Form in Greek Literature και The Oxford Handbook of the Literatures of the Roman Empire. Ο πληθυντικός, λογοτεχνίες, literatures, έχει σημασία διότι αναγνωρίζει πως η λογοτεχνική παράδοση στην Ρωμαϊκή Αυτοκρατορία δεν ήταν μοναδική, αλλά πολλαπλή. Ελληνική και λατινική βέβαια, αλλά και εβραϊκή, κοπτική και συριακή, μέσα στην Αυτοκρατορία, και νοτιοαραβική, παχλαβική και παλαιοαιθιοπική έξω από την Αυτοκρατορία, αλλά και επηρεασμένες από και επηρεάζοντας την λατινική και την ελληνική λογοτεχνία. Στα ερευνητικά του ενδιαφέροντα ανήκει και η θέση της πεζογραφίας στην ελληνική και παγκόσμια λογοτεχνία. Εκτός από άλλες ερευνητικές μελέτες, ο Phiroze έχει μελετήσει αναλυτικά τον Ηρόδοτο και έχει μεταφράσει στα αγγλικά το Daphnis και Chloe του Λόγκου για την σειρά των μεταφράσεων Penguin Classics. Η σημερινή ομιλία του σχετίζεται με την πεζογραφία. Οπότε με μεγάλη χαρά προσκαλώ τώρα στο βήμα τον καθηγητή Phiroze Vasunia για να δώσει την διάλεξη του με θέμα The Prose of the World, Hegel, Plutarch, Herodotus.
Ευχαριστώ πολύ. It's a pleasure to be here this evening. I first came to Athens in 1988 as a student. That was a memorable time, and I'm always very happy to come back. My thanks to the Institute of Historical Research at the National Hellenic Research Foundation, the British School at Athens, and the Institute of Classical Studies in London for the invitation to deliver this lecture. I'd like to thank in particular John Bennett for his hospitality, and Sofia Kremidi and Mirina Kalaitzi at the NHRF, and Greg Wolfe in London. When I was in Athens some 30 years ago, I had the good fortune to be taught by an inspiring and exceptional scholar, Professor Polymnia Athanasiadi. I still remember vividly one occasion when she took a few of us to the Agora and spoke to us brilliantly about Julian and his beliefs. I hope she won't be too embarrassed if I say that it's an extreme honor for me to see her at the lecture this evening. Let me begin. Monsieur Jourdain, I'm in love with a lady of great quality, and I wish that you would help me write something to her in a little note that I will let fall at her feet. Philosophy master, very well. Monsieur Jourdain, that will be gallant, yes? Philosophy master, without doubt. Is it verse that you wish to write her? Monsieur Jourdain, no verse. Philosophy master, do you want only prose? Monsieur Jourdain, no, I don't want either prose or verse. Philosophy master, it must be one or the other. Monsieur Jourdain, why? Philosophy master, because, sir, there is no other way to express oneself than with prose or verse. There is nothing but prose or verse. Philosophy master, no, sir, everything that is not prose is verse, and everything that is not verse is prose. Monsieur Jourdain, and when one speaks, what is that then? Prose. What? When I say, Nicole, bring me my slippers and give me my nightcap, that's prose. Oui, monsieur. By my faith, for more than 40 years, I've been speaking prose without knowing anything about it. In many literary cultures, in Greek and Latin, Hebrew and Arabic, English, Spanish, and German, for example, prose comes after verse. Verse is already there, sometimes in written form, sometimes not, and it's only later that prose emerges and makes its way into the world. It's difficult for some people to grasp the point about the belatedness of prose, since prose has an aura of the natural about it. Vlad Godzik and Jeffrey Kittay remind us that we live in a world transformed by the historical event of prose's emergence and subsequent spread. They write, we are already fully après prose. They use the French expression because they're writing about the French Middle Ages, not because they're being pretentious. The problem is dramatized most famously by Monsieur Jourdain in Molière's play, Bourgeois Gentilhomme, who, as you just heard, is surprised to discover that he has been speaking prose for 40 years without realizing it. The naturalness of prose is a relatively new phenomenon. In many ancient cultures, the arrival of prose was discussed, explored, and contested, often quite ferociously, as was its relationship with poetry. The seeming naturalness of prose makes it all the more challenging for us to discuss. In fact, the association between prose and the mundane is one of its important features in numerous literary traditions from antiquity to the modern period. We perceive something of this connotation of prose in the English word prosaic when we talk of prosaic matters as day-to-day concerns. Various critics have pointed out that at numerous historical moments, verse is reserved for lofty and grand themes and not for the menial, the humdrum, and the everyday. D.H. Lawrence writes that in prose fiction, you know that there's a water closet on the premises. George Steiner adds, we are not called upon to envisage such facilities at Mycenae and Elsinore. If there are bathrooms in the houses of tragedy, they are there for Agamemnon to be murdered in. In the 5th century BC in Greece, as that reference to Aeschylus suggests, there are certain things that apparently cannot be said in verse and are left to prose. Greek prose of a later era was also deprecated for its weaknesses. Until recently, many classical scholars used to claim that the early centuries of Greek prose, when it was at its freshest, were the golden years, that Greek prose of the later period was derivative and uninspired, that Greek oratory collapsed when Greek political freedom was snuffed out by the Roman Empire, and that the writings of the second sophistic were the insipid detritus of a powerless community. The neo-critical orthodoxies are suspicious of these narratives of decline, but it's nonetheless worth reflecting on the ideological hold and vigor of such readings. In the lectures on aesthetics delivered in Berlin in the 1820s, Hegel casts the relationship between form and the world in terms that remind us of the worldly attachments of prose. The philosopher writes that the beautiful days of Greek art are gone and the conditions of our present time are not favorable to art. The prose of the world, for him, describes the predicament of the modern individual, the person who lives in an age without true art, whose hands are tied by the bonds of present-day culture and is constrained by the bourgeois social order and the state. He says, no matter how far individuals may contribute to the whole with their own aims and accomplish what is in line with their own individual interest, still the independence and freedom of their will remains more or less formal, determined by external circumstances and chances and hindered by natural obstacles. This is the prose of the world as it appears to the consciousness both of the individual himself and of others. A world of finitude and mutability, of entanglement in the relative, of the pressure of necessity from which the individual is in no position to withdraw. There is a bleakness in Hegel's description of the current state of art and the plight of the individual, and this sense of disenchantment for him is suggested through such terms as prose and prosaic. In order to surmount the prose of the world, art needs to rise to a higher level. Art needs to find true beauty through which the poverty of nature and prose no longer peeps. And in the words of Friedrich Schlegel, lead to a cure for the epidemic of prosaic soberness. This cure may take the form of poetry. Hegel's view of poetry draws its power by placing the prose of the world within a state of disenchantment. For him, the prose of the world describes a life that is dull, commonplace, and lacking spirit, and that stands in contrast to the beautiful, the spiritual, and the transcendental. His point is not just about beauty. For him, art coheres with the realm of freedom and independence. Art ought to rebel against necessity. Poetry used to play that role, but it can no longer do so. Prose might have performed that function, but instead of opening up a space for the individual's sovereignty, prose ends up reaffirming the relationship between necessity and art. Hegel's arguments resonate with the works of other thinkers, and he's not alone in sketching a trajectory that passes from a poetic past to an alienated and prosaic present. We find elements of this approach to prose in the writings of many figures, from Schiller to Lukács, and one of the most vivid and moving accounts of the origins of prose in this line of thought is precisely the theory of the novel by Georg Lukács. Writing in a state of despair brought on by the First World War, Lukács sketches out a literary history that begins with the epic poetry of Homer and ends with the modern novel, and he attempts to show how the bourgeois novel is derived from verse epic. But there's a significant rupture between the worlds of Homer and of the bourgeois novel. In Homeric epic, according to Lukács, there was a coincidence between form and genre, subject and object, author and work, and aesthetics and metaphysics. As Lukács says in his memorable opening lines with their allusions to Kant and Novalis, happy are those ages when the starry sky is the map of all possible parts, ages whose parts are illuminated by the light of the stars. Everything in such ages is new and yet familiar, full of adventure and yet their own. The world is wide and yet it is like a home, for the fire that burns in the soul is of the same essential nature as the stars. The world and the self, the light and the fire are sharply distinct, yet they never become permanent strangers to one another, for fire is the soul of all light, and all fire clothes itself in light. But now, this rounded totality and unity have fragmented, and the industrialized world has made such a vision a thing of the past. Just as a work of art is now irretrievably detached from the artist who created it, so also any given genre has become separated from its original home, which gave that genre its transcendental right to existence. A consequence of the break with the epic tradition is, then, that form has become homeless, and the novel form is like no other, and expression of this transcendental homelessness. Verse continues to live on in Lukács's vision, but now it has transmuted into prose, which somehow bears a connection to its originary state. The change from poetry to prose is scarcely neutral and makes the latter form seem inadequate in comparison to the former. Poetry is the high point located in the distant past, while prose is the mode of alienation, disenchantment, and melancholy. What's evident in the schema proposed by Lukács, no less than in the schema proposed by Hegel, is the idea that prose represents the plight of the individual who lives in a society that is characterized by dullness, limited freedom, and socio-political bonds. Civilization has changed. The constraints on existence have become thicker and more oppressive, and the prose of the world is the art form of this situation. Reading Hegel and Lukács, one wonders whether prose necessarily has to be associated with such a state of affairs. Is poetry the only cure for the malaise of the soul? Does prose possess no advantages over poetry? Can prose play no happy role in mediating between the world and the individual? In attempting to dispatch these questions, you might want to heel out a powerful theorist of prose fiction such as Mikhail Bakhtin, and return once more to his analyses of the hybrid, the dialogic, the polyphonic, and the multivocal. I suggest that we turn instead to an author who lived in the early Roman Empire from about 50 to 120 CE, and also thought about the relationship between poetry and prose. Plutarch is extremely sensitive to questions of culture, society, and politics, but his ostensible interest in examining the decline of poetry and the rise of prose is linked to the behavior of the oracle at Delphi. It's fine, don't worry. One of his dialogues, one of Plutarch's dialogues, composed in Greek, is entitled, "Why are Delphic oracles no longer given in verse?" In fact, the title echoes a question that the characters in the dialogue attempt to answer, namely, why does the priestess at Delphi no longer give her responses in hexameter? The question is answered variously in the text, but the most sustained response comes from the character Theon, who views the oracle's use of prose as a positive development. The change is prostobeltion, he says, it's for the better. But circumstances and natures changed, and life changed with them. Utility drove out elaboration. Golden-haired ornaments vanished, long, soft dresses were laid aside, luxuriant hair was cut short, high boots were taken off. Men began very rightly to accustom themselves to letting the elegance of moderation rival that of extravagance, and to treat the plain and simple as no less ornamental than the luxurious and elaborate. Speech too shared in the change and set itself free. Sunapoluo menu, I believe is the word, sunapoluo menu, loosened, set free. Speech too shared in the change and set itself free. History descended from the chariot of meter, and prose became the mark that distinguished fact from fable. Philosophy came to prefer clear instruction to emotional impact and made her inquiries in plain prose. Plutarch adds, the coming of clarity made a difference to everything, including confidence. People used to be easily impressed by bombastic language, flowery passages, and obscure references, but gradually they came to be suspicious of the poetical forms of oracles as well as extravagance in metaphors, riddles, and ambiguities. They were right to be wary of prophetic utterances, for verse, meter, and rhythm increasingly was subject to abuse. Quacks and charlatans and false prophets, mendicants and altar scroungers and vagabonds simply made up their own oracles and preyed on slaves and women who were captivated by meter and poetical vocabulary. As the author remarks, poetry came to be thought to have prostituted herself, and this is why she was banished from truth and the tripod. I can't help making an aside here in referring to Thomas de Quincey, the author of Confessions of an English Opium Eater, who wrote an extremely perceptive analysis of Greek prose in the 19th century. He said, "Whoever heard of a prose oracle, and hence as Grecian taste expanded, the disagreeable criticisms whispered about in Athens as to the coarse quality of the verses that proceeded from Delphi. It was like bad Latin from Oxford. Apollo himself to turn out of his own temple in the very age of Sophocles such Birmingham hexameters as sometimes astonished Greece was like our English court keeping a Stephen Duck the Thresher for the National Poet Laureate at a time when Pope was fixing an era in the literature. Meter fell to a discount in such learned times." In the old days, to get back to our text, in the old days, moreover, as Theon also points out in the dialogue, the oracle was eager not to annoy kings and tyrants, and so distorted or concealed the true significance of prophecy by turning it into poetry. But the world is now changed. All is peace and quiet, war has ceased, there are no migrations or revolutions or tyrannies in Greece, or any other disorders and evils demanding complicated medication, as it were. In these circumstances, Theon goes on to say, it's entirely appropriate that the Pythia delivers her prophecies in prose. The Pythia's speech is, he says, the shortest line between 2 points. Her words have no twists or curves, no double sense or ambiguity. They go straight to the truth. They risk the test of belief. They take responsibility for themselves, and they have never yet been proved wrong. Besides, Theon adds, whatever it is that the Pythia appears to be proclaiming in her oracles, it seems to be successful, since Delphi is thriving more than ever and has become the site of wealth, immense prosperity, and magnificent temples. Plutarch's dialogue draws a connection between prose and the socio-political condition of Greece in his own time. The preference for prose in Delphi is mirrored by the happy state of Delphi and Greece more widely in the 1st and 2nd centuries CE. This is not to suggest that for Plutarch, the Hellenes of his day are ordinary simpletons incapable of grasping the complexities of poetical compositions. Rather, for him, they are seasoned readers and listeners too alert to be fooled by the lightning and thunder of showy language. Theon says that it is the province of children to seek out rainbows and halos and comets, by which he means riddles and allegories and metaphors. Children are impressed by flash and sizzle, whereas adults will have the wisdom to embrace the simplicity of prose. The Greeks are mature and civilized. They live in an empire governed by rulers who care for their achievements and their culture. Within this imperial framework, the age is inclined not to the tortured pronouncements of some poet Manqué writhing in a smoke-filled shrine. It seeks instead the clarity of a prosaic medium. Having journeyed thus far on foot with Plutarch, we should not come away with the idea that he undervalues prose or regards it as inferior to poetry. Far from treating prose with condescension, Plutarch appears to be suggesting that prose offers advantages that poetry cannot offer. As he says, echoing writers such as Cicero, speech or logos has been set free, it has been unloosened as it descends from the chariot of meter. Prose, once liberated from bondage, guides the truth out into the open, where everyone can appreciate its beauty, clarity, and directness. Prose allows you to tell the difference between the real, between talethes, and the fabulous, to Methodus. Nor should the transition from a more poetic to a more prosaic culture be taken to mean that people are less emotional than they were in earlier periods. Now they merely express their emotions in different ways. It may have been the custom once to compose a poem or sing a song when you fell in love. Are we to say that nobody falls in love nowadays? That love has disappeared because no one now, in Pindar's words, fires off the arrows of youth's honeyed song in meter or poetry? That would be absurd, says Theon in the dialogue. People fall in love with as much fire as they used to in the old days, but they talk about it in prose rather than verse. In making the case for prose, Plutarch not only defends the legitimacy of the oracle's practice, but implies that prose serves the god better because prose brings to fruition that which was already there in the poetry. This is an important point. Prose is suited to the times. Prose actually transfers more powerfully and directly that which entered into poetry, but poetry failed to communicate. According to Theon, the god of Delphi uses the Pythia to reveal his thoughts. Theon quotes an observation of Heraclitus: "The Lord whose oracle is at Delphi neither speaks nor conceals, but gives signs." Grasping the meaning of these signs is not easy, especially when their significance is conveyed in a language that is clouded by dark phrases and rhythmic complexity. When she spoke in verse, the Pythia was the channel for the god's signs, but she was not always understood or well received. When she speaks in prose, the Pythia remains the god's medium, but the new form makes his signs intelligible and persuasive, so that prose expresses that which was previously mangled, misconstrued, perverted, or suppressed. As these remarks indicate, there is for Plutarch something that lies beyond the verbal, behind the verbal, something that is prior to the word, that is in itself not accessible to our view, and that inheres in the divine. It lies with the God. The God may communicate to human beings and use the soul as his instrument, but he does not himself compose the verses and put the oracle into the Pythia's mouth. The Pythia delivers the prophecies of the God in whatever medium she can muster, and she now uses prose with what appears to be a greater chance of mantic achievement than in centuries past. It may be tempting to infer from this structure that prose has a poetic residue in it, but I think that Plutarch implies rather that the relationship is the other way round for him. For him, poetry contains within it a prosaic seed that only prose can bring to fruition. Prose adds something to the discourse so that the audience is able to perceive its significance with full clarity. Poetry has never been able to achieve this degree of success, comprehensibility, and transport. With prose, the words exceed their surly bonds and touch the hearts and minds of their listeners. It's not just that meter, rhythm, and metaphor have prevented poetry from attaining its potential. These features can be found also in prose, as many ancient critics observe. Prose must nonetheless have a special quality, for it's only in the age of prose that the oracle's words have hit their listeners with such surety and force. Prose is able to reach back past the oracle and connect to that truth which the god wishes to convey. You can refer to that truth as metaphysical, transcendental, the real, or das Ding an sich if you want to. However you described it, poetry could merely offer the germ of that divine truth and could not awaken it to life. Now, in Plutarch's own time, prose has triumphed over poetry as the perfect vehicle for the divine kernel, and the oracle speaks with fluency and certainty. At this point, I think we might reframe the literary history that Plutarch describes in his dialogue as the extension of poetry into prose. Poetry extends into prose. Prose, in turn, extends the powers of poetry and enhances its capabilities and its attainments. Godzik and Kitte write, the dimension of prose is extension. Prose extends poetic language because it comes after and because it is unfettered, unloosened, unhindered, free. Many centuries after Plutarch, Isidore of Seville is right to emphasize the sense of prose as an extension, even if he's wrong about the etymology of the Latin word prosa. He says prose, prosa, is an extended discourse unconstrained by rules of meter. The ancients used to say that prose is extended, productus, and straightforward, rectus. For Isidore, as for Plutarch before him, prose subsumes poetry, increases its purview, and continues it to a new level. And this extension is achieved because poetry holds within it a prosaic potential that prose awakens with its own sense of the possible. By offering us this notion, Plutarch is perhaps not far from thinkers of other ages who conceptualize art as a continuum of forms, or those who, for instance, represent prose fiction as the manifest culmination of a trajectory that commences with epic verse. We could find versions of this train of thought in Hegel, Lukács, Bakhtin, Walter Benjamin, and the German Romantics. In a letter that he sends to August Wilhelm Schlegel on 12th January 1798, Novalis writes, "If poetry wishes to extend itself, it will acquire a prosaic look. Its constituent parts will no longer stand in the same close community, or therefore under such strict rhythmic laws, and it will become more capable of portraying that which is limited." For Novalis, when poetry reaches its ideals and arrives at its highest state, poetry appears to turn into prose. Prose attains this goal partly by subsuming all poetic forms and surpassing them. As Benjamin observes, prose is the creative ground of poetic forms, all of which are mediated in it and dissolved as though in their canonical creative ground. In prose, all metrical rhythms pass over into one another and combine into a new unity, the prosaic unity. Benjamin shows that prose is the most profound realization of Novalis's analysis and the form most adept at fusing together the dreams of the German Romantics. By enlarging what poetry is capable of becoming, prose fiction is the highest poetic form. Plutarch's interest in the displacement of form by form of poetry by prose does not blind us to the socio-political conditions that accompany the affirmation of prose. Plutarch acknowledges the situation of Greece as a part of the Roman Empire in the dialogue. In this particular work, Greece under Roman rule enjoys an era of prosperity and peace. Peoples and cities are not concerned about armed conflict when they approach the oracle in Delphi, but about harvests, husbandry, and health. Near the end of the text, Theon seems to be saying that he loves the Roman emperor or governor for administering a policy that has led to the serenity and splendor of the region. Plutarch also thanks divine will for the blissful state of Greece, and his political allegiances are notoriously complicated to understand. It would therefore be misguided to claim that he's implying that prose has flourished only thanks to Roman rule. But one of the themes he investigates in his writing is assuredly the relationship between prose and freedom, whether understood dialectically or otherwise, and it's worth reflecting on the issue for a moment by taking a historical stance that stretches back beyond Plutarch to the early flowering of Greek prose. The earliest literary prose in Greek emerges in the shadow not of the Roman Empire, of course, but the Achaemenid Persian Empire. Many critics have written about the developments in Ionia on the western coast of Asia that accompanied the rise and spread of Greek prose from regions that were under Persian rule. As long ago as the 17th century, the French man of letters Claude de Saumaise, who used the Latin nom de plume Salmasius, and also Pierre-Daniel Huet, who wrote a colorful treatise on the origin of the novel, made the connection between Persia, the Milesian tale, and prose fiction. Of these authors, Huet, Pierre-Daniel Huet, theorizes his claim at greater length, and he essentially argues that the idea of prose fiction, or what he terms the romance, was passed over from the Persians to the Milesians, who then transmitted the concept to other Greek speakers in Ionia and the mainland. Huet has in mind fables, parables, and allegorical works, and he insists on the passage of these from east to west in his analysis. More recently, scholars have examined the earliest literary compositions that are said to have circulated in Ionia and shown how early philosophers and scientists composed works in prose in the 6th century BCE. Tradition makes Pherecydes the first person to have composed in Greek prose. But nothing is less worth remembering than the mere hollow shell of a name where all the pulp and kernel is gone, to quote De Quincey again. And the earliest Greek author whose prose work survives at any length is Herodotus. Herodotus' accomplishment as a prose stylist is spectacular. Edith Hall says, Herodotus almost single-handedly took writing without the aid of meter from the plodding parataxis of Acusilaus to high art. Jebb called him the Homer of European prose. His genius at word order and variation in colon length has never been surpassed. There are sentences in Herodotus of heart-stopping beauty, created by hyperbaton, the mirroring of the content in the aural effect as when the Nile rises, the use of an abstract noun to denote the onset of an emotion falling on someone, or the delicate bafflement or reserve that an oblique infinitive in indirect speech can insinuate. That was Edith Hall. Let's turn to a passage from Book 2, which contains his sprawling account of Egypt. Some of the Greeks say that this pyramid was built by Rhodopis, a courtesan, but that is quite wrong. They appear to me not even to know who Rhodopis was, for they would never have attributed to her the building of such a pyramid, on which, as one might say, countless thousands of talents must have been spent. Besides, Rhodopis was in her heyday during the reign of King Amasis and not during this king's reign. For Herodotus was born many years after the kings who left the pyramids behind them, and she was of Thracian origin and was a slave of Iadmon, the son of Hephaestropolis, a man of Samos, and she was a fellow slave of Aesop, the Logopoios. He too belonged to Iadmon, as is clearly proved by the following, that when the Delphians constantly proclaimed, as an oracle bade them, that whoever wished to should claim the atonement money for the murder of Aesop, no one appeared to claim it save Iadmon, another of the same name, a grandson of the first. So it is proved that Aesop belonged to Iadmon. We know from other sources, including Plutarch, that the people of Delphi unjustly murdered Aesop, and that Iadmon, the grandson of the slave owner Iadmon, came along to collect the compensation. That's the explanation of Herodotus' statement about financial atonement. Among the many fascinating achievements of this passage, at any rate, is how the author skillfully brings together the courtesan Rhodopis, rose-faced Rhodopis, and Aesop, the legendary composer of fables under the sign of slavery. It is a striking coincidence that Plutarch also mentions Rhodopis and Aesop in the context of a discussion about the value of prose, namely in the very dialogue that we have been discussing this evening. A character in Plutarch's text implies that the Delphians were wrong to commit Aesop to death, and thus he offers a brief rehabilitation of the prose fabulist. When Plutarch speaks in his own voice, he's more critical, as we shall see later. Of the two slaves mentioned by Herodotus, the one who matters is not the courtesan who causes the erection of the pyramid, but the slave who composes fables in prose. Herodotus uses the word logopoios in relation to Aesop, and as many scholars have shown, the word means maker of fables in prose. So that in this tradition, at least, Aesop composes his fables in prose. Herodotus does a complicated dance with the prose fabulist Aesop in his histories. On the one hand, he wants to avoid the negative connotations that attach to the logopoios and to shun the aura of the quotidian, the bestial, and the lowly that enshrouds the fables of Aesop. On the other, he composes a prose work that, for all its sweep and density, could well be regarded as profoundly Aesopic, that is, as a historical parable, complete with lessons and words of wisdom for its auditors. If we can trust the later biographical traditions, Leslie Kirk writes, Herodotus began his life on the mainland of Asia Minor, just like Aesop, crossed to Samos and spent time there, just like Aesop, and then spent much of his life traveling around the Greek world performing his Sophia, just like Aesop. Herodotus presents himself as a storyteller, but at the same time he revolutionizes what storytelling means and composes a work like no other on the tumultuous confrontation of Greeks and Persians. By the time Herodotus narrates his histories in the 5th century BCE, Aesop is already connected to stories that are composed in prose. This early association between prose and Aesop prompted some comment from Hegel. Aesop himself is said to have been a misshapen, humpbacked slave. His home is transferred to Phrygia. Aesop does not dare to recite his doctrines openly, but can make them understood hidden, as it were in a riddle, which at the same time is always being solved. In the slave, prose begins, and so this entire species is prosaic too. We should not be surprised to see Hegel commenting on the prosaic nature of the entire species of slaves. What is perhaps noteworthy is to see in Hegel the notion that the earliest prose originates in a language that puzzles and teases its audience. For Hegel, Aesop's fables communicate their doctrines through an obscure and witty language, through riddles and indirectness. In this sense, Aesop's fables are structurally similar to the mysterious utterances of the Delphic oracle, which also delivers its responses in words and phrases that are hard to understand. There's a difference. Aesop's fables are not underwritten by divinity and not offered as divine revelation. They're presumed to speak to all audiences, elite and non-elite alike, and that's one reason why they are classed by intellectuals in antiquity as abject, lowly, or trivial. The distance between the oracle and Aesop is the distance between God and the slave. By reminding us of the servile status of Aesop, Hegel grounds what he takes to be the origins of prose in the gross, the material, and the unfree, and he blithely follows the tradition that portrays Aesop as a repulsive, disfigured slave. It seems to me, however, that Herodotus takes over and recasts Aesop in his historical writing. Herodotus knows that he is embarking on a work that is radical and unprecedented, a novel and monumental effort, crafted in order that time may not draw the color from what man has brought into being, nor those great and wonderful deeds manifested by both Greeks and barbarians fail of their report. This achievement has to be realized in prose, but it cannot be tainted by Aesop's servility. What Herodotus achieves in effect is a liberation of prose from slave status. Remember, Plutarch said that speech set itself free. A half millennium earlier, Herodotus extends the metaphor by freeing prose both from metrical restraint and from a servile level. Herodotus is therefore anticipating an expression that becomes proverbial in the ancient world for prose as loosened up speech. In the Roman period, Quintilian likens historical writing to a common salutum, a poem that is loosened up or unfettered, a sentiment that Latin terms for prose such as oratio saluta and verba saluta also echo in their suggestion that language has been freed from the constraints of meter. Closer in time to Herodotus is Aristotle, who in the 3rd book of the Rhetoric cautions his readers away from meter, since metrical speech lacks persuasiveness, appears artificial, and at the same time distracts the hearer's attention. It's revealing that Aristotle refers to a freed slave in the course of making this point. You have to paint a picture in your mind, I think, of Herodotus as an author who takes the older tradition of prose and subjects it to a process so impulsive, so transformational, that language shivers and vibrates as he lifts it out of his servile harness and elevates it to a level hitherto unseen in Greek antiquity. Many writers in Greek and Roman antiquity were impressed by Herodotus' composition. Plutarch was not among them, or so he leads us to believe in his work on the malignity of Herodotus. Of a passage in Book 8 of the Histories, Plutarch writes that Herodotus no longer picks Scythians or Persians or Egyptians to utter the logoi which he invents himself, as Aesop picks crows and apes, but he uses the Pythian god as his mouthpiece to prevent the Athenians from receiving the first prize for valor at Salamis. Plutarch levels numerous accusations against Herodotus in that charged sentence. He attacks Herodotus for misrepresenting the Pythia, and making her say that the prize for valor was given to another city and not to Athens. You may suppose that he's being defensive yet again about the oracle at Delphi. He also presents a startling equation in which Herodotus is to Aesop as barbarians are to crows and apes. Of course, Aesop and Herodotus were both connected to non-Greek cultures, especially Phrygia and Thrace in the case of Aesop. As Johannes Haubold has shown in his book, not only is Aesop frequently represented as non-Greek by Greek and Latin authors, but also the genre of the Aesopic fable, with its roots in Mesopotamia, invites its ancient readers to reflect on those connections with the barbarian world. Plutarch is doubtless rebuking Herodotus, who he thinks loves barbarians a little too much, for being an Aesop in prose rather than the sophisticated historian he was already regarded as having become. Aesop is not the only person whom Herodotus calls logopoios in his histories. There's one other and only one other person to whom he refers by that word, namely his predecessor and perhaps rival Hecataeus of Miletus. This usage of logopoios has been discussed by Leslie Kirk, Gregory Nage, and others, so I'll only remind you this evening that Herodotus distances himself from Hecataeus. Hecataeus is said to have composed a treatise called the Periodos Geis, a journey around the world, or a map of the world, and his treatise is one of the earliest prose examples of the genre, along with one by another Ionian, the philosopher Anaximander. Neither of these treatises survives. From quotations in later authors, we may infer that Hecataeus' Periodos Geis, or Journey Around the World, was an attempt to offer an encyclopedic account of geography and was organized like travelers' guides describing daily journeys and stopping places. Herodotus laughs scornfully at Hecataeus in Book 4 of his histories without naming him. He rejects Hecataeus' idea that the world is encircled by a river called Ocean and offers an entirely new conception of the earth and its history and their representation in language. Herodotus' work is far too colorful to be described as a sequence of way stations, though he does include accounts of routes and roads on occasion as he comments on the known world. For all that, he shows the influence of Hecataeus. Herodotus redefines the meaning of historical, geographical, and ethnographic inquiry. Hegel felt that Herodotus was prosaic on the grounds that he abjured the gods and heroes of Homer and concentrated mainly on the human. Herodotus looks at Hegel and responds with his archaic smile. Prose has become a new signifying practice in the hands of Herodotus. He has liberated it from its shackles and made it something grander than the fable of an abject fabulist and the itinerary of a pedant. He writes about reciprocity and connectedness, the comings and goings of travelers and information, the importance of autopsy and informed conversation, and the critical need to understand the beliefs, cultures, and customs of other peoples, even if they are hostile to you, especially if they are hostile to you. In every way, he writes the prose of the world. Thank you.
Well, thank you very, very much, Phiroze, for that, if I may say so, wonderfully rich and clear example of prose, which perhaps on occasion touched on verse. I'm sure you'd be happy to answer questions, so I'll throw the floor open for questions and observations, please. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for a fascinating lecture, which addresses many questions that have been on my mind for a very long time. I don't know why, and perhaps you will correct me. I had thought that the move from poetry to prose was very largely due to technological causes, mainly the discovery or the use of forms of writing. And that poetry was due very largely to the need to memorize from one generation to the next what was being said, Homer, for instance, or Hesiod. But you seem to suggest that perhaps there was more to it, much more to it, and two things that I have captured from your very rich presentation was, first of all, the demystification of poetry and the subjects of poetry, namely religion, for instance, Hesiod. And then, of course, the triumph, what I would call the triumph of rigor and skepticism that you begin to see with Plato and Aristotle even more so. And Thucydides, of course. Thucydides and Herodotus are both historians, but the way Thucydides writes history is very, very different from that of Herodotus. And I wondered if you would comment on this. And the other thing is, you touched on it, this Hellenistic period and under the Roman Empire, and the more humane, rather prosaic concerns that begin to take over. And just for information purposes, I was attending a lecture by Professor Herodotus of Princeton University some days ago in New York. And he was saying how the Hellenistic period brought together civilizations that had very little been in touch. You mentioned the Coptic, the Kurdish, in fact, he sought. Of course, Hebrew, Latin, and Greek. Thank you so much. I talked too much, but...
Thank you for your comments and your questions. There's a lot of truth to what you say about poetry and prose, and the idea that poetry can often function as an aid to remembering language and remembering texts. And certainly the fact that Homer was composed in verse, in meter, certain rhythms and so forth, allowed him and his poems, the Iliad and the Odyssey, to be memorized we might say, more easily. There are other reasons too why those poems were recited from memory. It's not only the fact that it was composed in a certain meter that allowed for that to happen, but yes, it's certainly the case that there were recitation from memory is facilitated when texts are composed in verse. I may be mistaken, but I think the current anthropological theory is that initially cultures at a very early, history of humanity at a very early stage, culturally speaking, people are communicating in a language that is something like song or rhythmic language and so forth. And that speech, in a way, differentiates itself out of that kind of more song-like mode of communication. So there's something archaic, there's something fundamentally archaic and early about what we would now call verse or poetry or rhythmic, metrical language. You also asked about the origin of prose in technical writing and in scientific writing. Yes, and again, it is the case that prose emerges out of Ionia, Greek-speaking Ionia, and is connected with philosophical and scientific and technical writing from a very early date. And that's certainly the conventional view of the emergence of prose in the Greek world. but I think what I was trying to add to that picture as well, which others too have pointed out, is that environment of Asia Minor, what we sometimes call Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, etc., was in the ancient world also very multicultural. It was part of the Persian Empire. There were Greek-speaking peoples living there, but they were in contact with peoples who also participated and belonged to other cultures and spoke possibly other languages as well. So Herodotus is coming out of that context. Halicarnassus is in that part of the world. And so he comes out of that context, and we think then moves to Athens later. So he's born a subject of the Persian Empire and then moves towards the Greek world and is reflecting, I think, that cultural richness and density in his writing. So I think it's important to connect prose too with that kind of cultural thickness. Yeah. One of your questions was about, I think, Hellenistic period. Yes, yeah. Yes, and I think Professor Haniotis has just shown us with his new book the richness of the Hellenistic period as well. It's a wonderful book. You'll find a praise from me printed on the back cover of that very book. It's a very rich and colorful evocation of the Hellenistic period and the richness of its cultural forms and its life in that political setting. I was suggesting that earlier scholars of previous this is now much earlier scholars, used to look with disfavor on Hellenistic Greek, but that is certainly no longer the case. But there used to be a time when that kind of, this is almost a 19th century view, when that kind of Greek was seen as derivative or somehow not up to the same standard as 5th, 4th century Greek. So the English historian George Grote is one of the people who made that kind of view also very prominent. For him, the 5th century was the period of Athens' golden age, and then everything else was decline. And he blamed Alexander the Great especially for that period of decline. He thought that Droysen, the German historian, had been mistaken in seeing in Alexander as a world historical figure in that kind of Hegelian sense. He thought Alexander was responsible for all sorts of corruptions of Hellenism.
I wonder if you could comment, you hinted at the growing self-confidence of writers in prose. And I wonder if you could comment on if this growing self-confidence was influenced by what can be seen as a common denominator between verse and prose. And that common denominator, I think, is performance. Mm-hmm. We know that from Herodotus onwards, many genres in prose were publicly performed, mm-hmm. and they were performed with great success, mm-hmm. even very positivistic genres like mm-hmm. historiography or philosophy and so on. Mm-hmm. So I wonder if this growing self-confidence of writers in prose, the way they viewed themselves as mm-hmm. artists, mm-hmm. was actually influenced by how they saw that they could cause emotions pretty much like high art in verse could.
Mm-hmm. That's a very good question. It's a difficult question to answer as well. The evidence for the performance of prose in the ancient world is not always easy to read. But as you say, there are these texts that suggest that Herodotus read out from his histories. There's suggestion that Thucydides was even present at one of the readings, and so on and so forth. So there is this material that refers to a performance of prose material. I think the prose writers such as Plato as well, coming soon after Herodotus, and others, Isocrates and others, they're very conscious that they're coming after verse, after poetry, which is, as you say, a performative form. A writer such as Plato, for instance, is in fact incorporating many of these performed genres in his genre, the new philosophical genre that he is in the process of constructing, which we now call philosophy, or the philosophical dialogue. In a way, he's deliberately saying that he's doing something new in response to these other poetic genres. The ending of the symposium, Plato's dialogue, is very interesting in this respect. You may remember that Socrates is arguing with, I believe it's Agathon and Aristophanes at the very end of the symposium. And Socrates is talking about, Agathon is a tragic poet, Aristophanes the comic poet, and Socrates is talking to them about tragedy and comedy. The night has drawn on, it's getting late, it's now early morning, everyone has fallen asleep, they've drunk too much, except for Socrates, who's still going, still talking. Eventually even Agathon and Aristophanes fall asleep, but Socrates is still as energetic as ever. And what happens at the end? Well, everyone else falls asleep, but Socrates, we're told, goes about his business as usual for the rest of the day, and then goes home and has a bath and rests. In the way that I understand that ending, what Plato is almost suggesting is that, like Socrates, he is offering prose a home, a new home, and this new home is embedded in the polis, in the city-state of Athens. And it's not going to be like tragedy, it's not going to be like comedy, but it's going to draw to some extent on tragedy, on comedy, on epic poetry, and other things. But what he's doing is creating a new home for a new person, such as Socrates, and a new prose form. So that would be one way of answering, somewhat unsatisfactorily, I admit, your question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your talk. Would you say that the development from poetry to prose, with the kind of meaning that you have brought out, could have some parallels in the development in the visual arts?
What do you mean by that?
Like, can we see either sculpture or painting developing in the course of time from the classical period to early antiquity in ways that may mimic?
So, yeah, that's a very good question. There are certainly changes taking place in the visual arts over the course of the 5th century, which is when Herodotus is composing. But I'm not sure that I could easily make a connection between prose and the visual arts in a very direct fashion, as simply as you're suggesting. There may well be a connection there, but it's part of a broader set of cultural changes that is taking place over the 5th century. So I wouldn't say that the changes in the visual arts are directly linked or caused by changes from verse to prose. I think that would be too strong a degree of causation there. But certainly there are changes taking place. There are political changes. The democracy becomes stronger, arguably, over the 5th century. There's all sorts of upheaval in Athens, the Peloponnesian War. There are innovations in religion. There are changes in religious form. So it's a complicated context, and I wouldn't quite so simply set up the causation in that fashion.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Panagiotis Ioannidis. Thank you for this wonderful choreography of different authors, culminating in praise for Herodotus. A minor point, perhaps, that struck me while you were commenting on Plutarch's views is that he doesn't mention it, or at least in the fragments you discussed, but certainly in the oracles and more generally in poetry, what is needed, and we know this was happening also during the times that the oracles were in verse, is interpretation. Whereas prose does not require interpretation, at least to the same degree. And interpretation, historically, is a more or less democratic process, or at least requires disputation, and this can be dispensed with prose. So I wondered whether that might fit somewhere. Thank you.
Yeah, well, there's different levels of interpretation. So, in your question, Plutarch does say at one point that when the oracles were given in verse, then you needed someone to interpret, someone who might have even been standing right there by your side as the oracle was being delivered, to interpret that oracle. And that gave rise to problems. So those people could be bribed, or they could be corrupted, or they could be just quacks who didn't really know what they were saying. So Plutarch is concerned with that kind of immediate interpretation of the oracle that's taking place. But then I think you're also asking about a further question, which is the interpretation that might happen at a later stage when the verse is delivered, it's uttered, it's received, then you take it with you, you go somewhere else, and then you discuss the meaning of that kind of that verse. And yeah, so perhaps you're implying that Plutarch sees that kind of debate, disputation over a verse as something of a problem. He doesn't come out right and quite say that. I mean, I don't think he's necessarily against discussion, debate, dialogue of that kind. So he's not opposed to that. The text itself, why are oracles no longer given in verse, is in the manner of a dialogue. It's set up as a kind of dialogue, and the three texts set in Delphi by Plutarch have dialogic dimensions to them. So I wouldn't quite say that Plutarch is against dialogical interpretation, if that's what you were saying, but perhaps you were not saying that. He is concerned, however, that not everyone was up to the task of interpreting these complicated oracles. And he's saying that partly the problem is the oracles, but partly also the problem lies in the interpreters. And it's better in prose because things are direct and straightforward. That kind of understanding of prose is almost modern in its sensibility. That prose is kind of mimetic. There's a one-to-one relationship between prose and the rest of the world. Whereas we don't expect that of poetry. We do sometimes ask that, or we ask that more of prose than of poetry.
So thank you for a very thought-provoking talk. My question is quite simple, then I have to pose two suggestions, or not suggestions actually, side questions. What happens between Plutarch and the 18th century and Hegel? And I'm saying this for two reasons. That's why I actually would like to ask this question. Is first of all, in Hans Blumenberg's The Laughter of the Thracian Slave, maybe where he actually takes one of those, that very famous joke about Thales and the Thracian slave, and how Thales fell, and then the Thracian slave laughed at him, etc., and draws this kind of history of how this is used as a kind of debate across time, all the way till the 20th century, about the role of philosophy and of the philosopher. And I wonder whether there's like similar things, and there's been a similar use of what all those debates that come from antiquity that have continued afterwards, all the way to Hegel. And he's not just rediscovering, for example, Plutarch, but he's continuing on traditions that like pre-existed this kind of linear continuity about that debate between prose and verse. Especially, and that's my second postulate, if we consider that in something like the Christian religion, this tension between verse and prose is as a matter of fact, very, very present. Thank you.
Those are two very difficult questions. Yeah, well, the first question is about the tradition, if you will, between Herodotus, or Plutarch rather, and the modern era, and the connection there between I think you're asking about the connection there between prose as a kind of form that is not adequate to the task of philosophy, and is connected with what is servile and mundane, and on the other hand, the tradition that poetry can rise above that. This dichotomy is repeated at times, but of course people periodically also constantly disrupt it and break it down. So there are of course several texts from the Middle Ages onwards that are poetic, but that are also deeply philosophical in their import. And you could mention any number of them. Dante is of course just one example in that tradition. I think what Hegel is more concerned about, though, is that because of something intense, something special happening in the modern period, in the modern era, thanks to the rise of a certain notion of the individual, thanks to the rise of industrialism, thanks to the rise of trade and early capitalism on a large scale, something is happening that is eventually leading to a kind of disenchantment. And he's getting this from German romantic thinkers. And then, of course, it's the strain that Marx picks up and develops in the 19th century. So for Hegel, that problem of prose, the servile on the one side, and poetry and the beautiful and the truthful on the other, is something that he's getting out of the German romantic tradition, but it's related to his understanding of modernity. And he thinks that this is a problem for the modern period, in a way that it wasn't a problem for the early period. I'm not sure I'm directly answering your question, but it's a very complicated and a difficult question to answer.
Yes, thank you very much for this lovely lecture. Getting back to the point you were mentioning with Plato and this continuous question, prose versus verse, I think in Plato we have precisely an idea of complementarity of verse, though, as you said, he is the father of philosophy in opening the world to the orthos logos. He is continuously referring, as you said yourself, to poetry as a divine inspiration, and which comes as a complementary aid to logos when it has come to the human limit.
Yeah.
So in one way, this verse, having apart from the pneumatic quality, also this allows repetitivity, which gives a divine road to the reader and to also to the poet. The poet is inspired by God, he says in the Aeon, and this is a way to come closer to certain truths that are not so easily done through dialectic. I mean, it is with the same aim to reach the full truth. And of course, Plato proposes the dialectic method, but at the moment of difficulty, he asks the poet for the final word. Simply something I was thinking of with your lecture. Thank you.
Yes, well, Plato's position on poetry is complicated, and as you know, in the Republic, Socrates is very skeptical of poets, and there's the famous opposition that people ascribe to Plato in that dialogue between philosophy and poetry, and Plato is one of the concerns that Plato has with poetry is that it is too mimetic, it's too removed, it can mislead people. People might watch tragedy or listen to Homer and go off in a different direction because of the things that they're seeing or listening to. So that's one part of Plato's relationship with poetry. But on another side, we might say that Plato never ceases to incorporate poetry into his own dialogues. There's always some poetic quotation, there's some snatch of poetry that Socrates or somebody else is quoting in the dialogues. Not just in the Symposium, but in a whole range of dialogues, even in the Republic for that matter. So Plato is, in the very dialogue in which he expresses such skepticism about poetry, incorporates poetry into the philosophical dialogue. In the Ion, he's especially concerned about rhapsodes, and I think he's uneasy about the rhapsode assuming the persona of the poet without actually being a poet, and he's troubled by the ease and the facility with which the rhapsode does this, and that he thinks that it's also misleading and again dangerous that the rhapsode can do this sort of thing, that the rhapsode can assume this poetic persona and perform or recite verses of Homer. So I think, at least in the way that I understand the Ion, Socrates is not simply championing poetry there. He's asking his readers to be cautious about the way in which it is performed and received by audiences.
Well, maybe that's a good moment to close. I hate to reduce us to a mundane level, but these have been quite interesting times in the past few days in Britain, in politics. And I look at the Kathimerini every morning and hear about Calpes and Eclogues. It reminds me of a saying that I heard once, which is that politicians campaign in verse, but they govern in prose. So with that sort of banal comment, I'll thank you all for your presence here this evening. Thank you all for coming. And thank you once again, Phiroze, for a wonderfully rich and varied talk and also discussion. Thank you.